Well, happy Sunday night, guys. We just finished our Refounding Fathers show, and now we get to do Conservatism on Tap, which is always my detox show. I love
The fun
having
here.
Kyle and Chris on the show. Kyle is a libertarian, Chris is a liberal, and they always test me. We're talking about critical race theory and just two super smart guys, neither conservative. And so now I do get to hang out with a couple of conservatives, and you get to tell me, like what all I said wrong and should have said. But I've got John here on the show. John, my brother, has been with me from the beginning on this. Always thankful for him. And I know you got some stuff to show us tonight, John. But we are also blessed and honored to have Josh on the show. Josh has an amazing podcast called Saving Elephants, and which includes the Republican kind, which he's happy to explain. But welcome, Josh. We're so happy to have you on the show.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
Yeah, it's nice to be here with you both. Earlier today, I was actually on a panel discussion in which I was the lone Republican. So I guess this is a bit of a refresher for me, too.
Yeah, can you tell everybody, because we got a couple of folks that looks like they've already jumped on live, and feel free to comment if you're watching this live and let us know. But tell us a little bit about it. I mean, you've had me on it, which I had a blast, but tell us a little bit about your project, Josh, and what you've done.
Yeah, Saving Elephants is a project trying to restore the Republican Party, and by which I mean trying to call the Republican Party back to a more intellectual, a respectable tradition, one that Edmund Burke is certainly one of the founders I look to, among others. Conservatism has an amazing history of brilliant intellectuals that, quite frankly, I felt a little cheated when I started to find out about these guys. Like, why has no one ever told me about this? And so I try to speak to our fellow millennials, saying there's a rich history here. And if you are tired and exhausted by what usually passes for political conversations, then come to Saving Elephants.
Yeah, I mean, you would think that the only conservative worth knowing these days is Donald Trump, but like talking to you and then of course we talk about it on our show. There's this long history, goes back. I mean, we talk about Edmund Burke from the 18th century, right? But then there's just so many others. That kind of gets lost in the daily cycle. So I love talking about that. But, on this show, we talk about politics. We also drink. So I got some Dragon's Milk, and I'll show you this here. This is bourbon barrel aged. This is my last one, 11%. So if I start slurring, you'll know why. This is from Michigan, which wasn't all that close of a state. But you know what? I'll drink from them anyway. Roasted, malty, and smooth. And I'm very, very happy about that. How about you, John?
So what I decided to pick up today, this is from over in Charlottesville. So I don't know if you can see it right there.
Yeah, that's where my alma mater is. Hey-o.
Exactly. I figured you'd like that.
I love it.
But they collaborated with Bold Rock, and they made this coffee roast apple cider, which I thought was extremely good. I had it last year when I brought my daughters up to pick apples over there, because you can pick a whole number of things. But of course, it's really great when you can send them up running up and down the hills to pick all these apples, and you're just sitting there drinking like this coffee-based cider that's every bit of like 8%. So extremely good. But I was telling Josh before the show started that like there was a time where the Dragon's Milk, like that's pretty much what I cut my teeth on with like bourbon aged stuff, along with a lot of party wood gingerbread stouts. And there was a time where it was like if it was like less than 10%, it's like no. Not even going to taste it. Like it's not even worth my calories, unless it's over like 11%, and then I'll give it a sip. So I went through that phase, but it's a good case to go through.
Josh, we had you, I think, on the show a while ago. We did an interview, before, but I seem to remember that you were saying that you don't drink, right? Like,
yeah,
okay,
yeah, teetotaler. I started off in a religious tradition in which we didn't drink, and I've just continued that habit. I have enough bad habits in my life. I figured maybe I shouldn't pick one up, an additional one. I am drinking from it's apropos my Saving Elephants mug.
There we go.
Assam tea, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is from northeastern India. Decaf, because it's late enough at night. I can't have.
Well, there's no judgment. Caffeine. I'll tell you that there's no judgment on conservatism on tap. So you are welcome anytime. And if that's what's coming from the tap, then that's awesome. I will tell you that John is the one who got me drinking, because we grew up in Tennessee and stuff, and out there as I got old enough to drink and came back home from college and stuff. Like, I mean, you got like Coors Light, Bud Light. There was like Natty Light, right? Like all the lights, right? Like, and then John went to Ireland, right? Which right around the time that I started getting into Edmund Burke, right? He's from Ireland. and spent a year abroad there. And when he came back, he's like, "Let me tell you something, Wes. Guinness." And I was like, "I don't think I've ever made it that far down the beer aisle." And he was like, "Heavy beer is where it's at." And he got me into the porters and the stouts, and clearly is still educating me on what to drink. And as you start to get into some of these, like, more exotic beers and home brews or local breweries, it can be really, really good. So,
So I got a beer tip of the day. Beer tip of the day is
yes.
that if you can enjoy the flavor of your beer when it's really close to room temperature
Yeah.
and it still tastes extremely good, that's a very well brewed beer.
Hmm.
A lot of times especially with like the barrel aged stuff, Wes, is if
Yeah.
you let that get closer to room temperature, you start getting a little bit more of the flavor to come out of it. And
Yeah.
I'll never forget. So I have a story. It's Hardywood Brewery is in Richmond, Virginia, and this is before they really went big with their products. But they had one called the Milkman, and they collaborated with Cigar City Brewing over down in Florida, which is where you're at.
Yeah.
And they made a thing called the Milkman. It was 13%. It had like 3 different types of chocolate in it. It had like cocoa nibs. It had chocolate chips. They were throwing in like cocoa powder into the thing. And I was like, oh, I got my buddy Chris, who I was talking about, the other week, right? I was like, Chris, we've got to go find this. It's going to be amazing. And we went over there and we talked to the brew owners, and they said that like half their batches that they had at their site had gone bad. And the other half they had distributed out to like the area of Richmond. So like they didn't have any.
Yeah.
So we had to we were waiting, and we called every other business that worked with Hardywood, because we got a list. And we would call like a business every day and be like, do you have the Milkman? Do you have the Milkman stout? And like they all said no. And there was like months went by.
Yeah.
Months. And then Chris came over, like he burst into my office and he was like, dude, I found it. And you will never believe where it's at. It's like right next to my apartment. It's at a bar right there. I was like, we got to go right now. So basically we called out of work and we went over there. And that is where we had one of our first like true, really good beers together. And we started bonding for the rest of the night. But as we talked, we let that beer get to room temperature. And it was, I'll never forget, like that's where I started developing a flavor profile for dark beers that, okay, this is how it tastes when it's super cold. But if you want to actually be fancy about it, and actually appreciate the taste, then you'll serve it room temperature. Yeah. And if it's still good, it's worth it.
That's awesome. Oh, that's what I'm talking about. He's still educating me on that stuff, and it's fascinating. I will tell you, I've got some local stuff as well. Let you guys would love this. Part of Burke's philosophy and what you were talking about, Josh, is a focus on localism, right? Like so much of politics, and we talk about this on the other show all the time. So much of politics is so sensationalistic. It's national. Who's the president? That's all we care about. Like the big companies, the big corporations, going back and forth between big government, and then big business. And we had right down the street a little local market set up behind a little store called Pickett's, which is a craft store. And there was probably about 100 people, and they had all their little things, and they were selling like little handmade dolls and stuff of Iron Man or whatever. My son got one of those little necklaces and stuff. And then, of course, I went for the food. So I got to read this to you as well. So I got some monkey butter, 4 ounces of this stuff. Ingredients are bananas, pineapple, granulated sugar, lemon juice, and salt. Made in a cottage food operation that is not subject to Florida safety regulations. That's what I'm talking about. That's her favorite stuff. We got some kiwi jam, white kiwi jam. And then this is like one of the other things that she said was her best, which is a mango salsa with tomatoes, mangoes, pineapple, apple cider, green peppers, onions, cilantro, jalapeno peppers, lemon juice, garlic, and salt. And it's also not subject to any safety regulations. So I will be enjoying that. If I get sick, if I keel over and die, you'll know maybe there was something to the safety regulations after all. But, that's to me, that's what it's all about, is like local brews and, exotic stuff, trying different things, and then, of course, supporting the local community. So that's how I think my local politics, my localism, and my appetite go together. So there you go.
So one thing that I was thinking about too was that whenever I go to those farmers markets, I always gravitate towards like the honey vendors who have like the local honeys. Have you seen anything like that?
Oh, yeah.
This is like the wildflower honey, and this is the clover honey, and this is honey infused with lavender, and and I'm just like dipping like the little swab, I guess, and you're tasting all that local stuff. That is super good. And if you ever, I don't know if Florida has them around, but Richmond is getting better about having some meaderies actually involved where they use those same kind of honeys and they end up fermenting that and developing like a very nice wine with the honey. But it's starting to gain a lot of traction over here as well. I might bring one on board
Gosh,
here.
you're from Oklahoma, right? Isn't that what you said?
Yeah. Yeah. Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah, I mean they've got some amazing. I've been there before. They got some amazing local culture and eateries and things like that. That's a great place to be too.
It's kind of funny because as you guys were talking and you were talking about localism in particular, one of my favorite places to eat here in Tulsa is called the White Lion.
Okay.
And ironically, it's founded by people directly from Britain. It's a British restaurant right in the heart of Tulsa, but it feels like you step into an old British pub when you walk into this place.
That's
it's
awesome.
So what do you like to order there?
I order the Cheshire. I'm not entirely certain what it is. It just sounds cool. A lot of peas and I mean British food, to be frank, isn't necessarily known for tasting amazing. It's good, but it's more about the atmosphere. You just feel like C.S. Lewis is in the next room smoking a pipe. That's what the beer is
for.
I kid you not. I feel the exact same way. I went over to London when I was studying abroad, and I was like, I am ready. I am ready to taste some British food. And like, I think that what I learned is that the Brits they do breakfast extremely well. We went to this place called, I think the Muffin Man, but like they had like this very fancy tea sets. You have your English tea, you have your crumpets, you have your jams and your butters, and it's just like it's so many carbs, and like the egg Benedicts are like light and fluffy, and it was super good. But when I went out for lunch and I went out for dinner, I don't remember what I ate. I think that because I was drinking too much. But like there was like French fries, I think, or chips, and there was like fish
and chips.
Yeah, fish and chips, and like that was pretty much like there. And there was like Guinness pies and like a bunch of like the porridge pies where you just basically crust it up and it's all a goop and it mixes up together with vegetables that are cut. But I'm like, I don't really know if this is supposed to be like that good, but I'm in like a pub, and I see books around and that's a cool accent. Like this is the life. This
guy was so into English culture and Irish culture and the whole thing. I took him down to Miami once, right? Like paid for his trip, flew him down to Miami. This is in like March, right? When it's not too hot, not too cold. You can go out onto the beach, Miami Beach, all this stuff. You get all these different like Cuban restaurants. You get the authentic, the really good stuff. Like in terms of drinking, like whatever you want. You got all the outdoor restaurants and stuff. We find the only like English pub in Miami. I didn't even know they had an English pub. It was completely empty. And I was like, what are we doing here? And he was like, I'll have a heavy beer thing. I'll have a Guinness thing. I'm like, what?
It's kind of like the guy that goes to another city and goes to the McDonald's.
Basically, that's what happened. I was like, I gotta find. Is there a brewery anywhere in Miami West? And you were like, I don't know. Let's just look. And like, we went to some tap house. That's what it was. And they had like I remember it was like some monks, like some abbey monks, like in like the stained glass windows around. I'm like, yeah.
I was like, where are we? Like, Miami's going to go to England. Like, but I love this discussion because I want to relate this back to Bert because, like, oh, and I'm going to do it too. It's important. It's important because like so much of politics and life today, like it feels like it's about eliminating like any sense of localism and like culture and differences. You're either a Republican or you're a Democrat. You're either a conservative or you're a godless liberal, right? Like there's all these judgments made. Californians are all liberal. And dude, like I was a part of this. Like to be honest with you, my wife is from New England. And like until I went up there and hung out in New Hampshire, I thought every New Englander was an atheist and a liberal and just like completely secular and like running from God. And I was like, that's how they are. And then I went up there and I met her family who's like devoutly Catholic, right? Like more conservative than probably anybody that I've ever met. Like, like country, all of that stuff. And like, we went camping, like it was as right wing as it gets, and it was shocking to me because I was like, man, I have such bad stereotypes and assumptions about people and I need to get over it. And then like, I mean, up there in New Hampshire, like there's a whole different like accent and everything else. And like, yeah, we're going to pick you up in Boston, But then what are we going to do? We're going to listen to country music, and go back and like hang out at our very like suburban home, right? Like I was like, wait, you're listening to like Kenny Chesney, like, and he's singing about the South. And they're like, yeah, we love it, and I'm like, what? Where am I? Right? Like there's this diversification that is just being trampled on, by people who are all about expanding either big business or big government. And it just feels like there's no space in between. Which side are you on? And I love, like, I don't care if it does cost, a couple extra bucks from some white kiwi jam. Like, I'm good for it because it supports local businesses, local culture, and the diversity that is just like makes life so much more fun. So I appreciate you guys indulging me.
Well, Wes, when you were talking about, I mean, I was just thinking about, your wife and just how much she's meant to me and the whole family. But she's Catholic, and
Yeah.
I remember that being kind of a point of contention at one point in the
Yeah,
family.
it was.
We're all grown up Baptists, and her family's
Heretics.
Catholic. And I'm pretty sure I hadn't like stepped in, aside from like being in Ireland and England, and walking around there and like visiting, Westminster Abbey, which was a pretty cool thing. Outside of that, though, that I had no other experience being in any sort of like cathedral area, or even like
Oh yeah.
entertaining the notion that Catholicism was actually like legit. If anything, I was always bringing like, why would you pray to the saints? And like that's bogus stuff.
Yeah, that Mary woman. What did she ever do for society? Like,
Right. I'll tell you this: like after y'all got married, I work right across from the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart in Richmond, and one of the things that I love is they keep their doors open until like sundown.
Yeah.
So like the doors are
Yeah.
completely open. You can come on in whenever you want, and that's where I started to go in and have my prayers, because they have an area where you can pray in front of whichever statue you want to, but there's one of Jesus. And you can see the candles that are all laid out there of everyone who is praying for the day. And there's just something very special. And what's been encouraging to me is that I would not have gone into that cathedral had I not met Kat.
That's cool, man.
Right? Had you not, met her, like that would have been an area of my life left unexplored, most likely. And it's been such a good moment to go in there every afternoon and to be able to just say a prayer, join with the saints, and feel a sense of communion, with everyone together. But like that wouldn't have happened unless, Kat had entered into our lives.
That's awesome, dude. One of the things that really started our relationship when we were dating was my ability to ask questions, instead of rushing to judgments, and hers to do the same. And I'll give you a couple examples, is I asked her that. I was like, what's the deal with praying to the saints? And she gave me an answer. I was like, what's the deal with the Eucharist? As opposed to, like rushing to judgment, like this is ridiculous, or, I don't believe this, or where is this in the Bible and stuff like that. Like just asking questions. And you know what that did is that it allowed her to ask questions of me, which again goes back to culture sharing and learning and stuff like you were talking about. We went into a Protestant church, right? Being a Protestant myself. And I took her into a Baptist church, and she was just like, where's the cross? And I was like, the cross. She's like, what do you, I mean, yeah, like it's Calvary, the whole thing. She's like, yeah, no, but like, why not have a cross in the sanctuary since we're Christians? And I was like, well, of course we have one in the sanctuary. It's right over somewhere, right? And there wasn't, like in this particular church, there was no cross anywhere. And I was like, maybe it's on the steeple. And we like literally walked outside, and I was like, oh, it's not there either. And I was like, that's a really good point. She's like, yeah, like, what do you look at whenever, you're at worship? And I was like, the guy with the electric guitar with the smoke behind it, like, I was like, maybe they should have a cross, like. And then I went up to the pastor. I was like, can we get a cross here? And he was like, well, we have one. It's I was like, we're both like, oh, right. There's these oversights that you miss if you're just kind of in a bubble, and she helped break me out of that. And again, that goes back to Burke, right? One of the reasons that I love Burke and I have his, face right here is because he had both a Catholic parent and he had a Protestant parent. So he came from a mixed household, even back in the 18th century when that was like in Ireland, like, whoa, right? Like he had these different perspectives. And I think he had a very nuanced understanding of Scripture and of God and appreciation for the mystery of God and all that stuff. And it's just one more reason why I love this guy, and love being able to talk about it. I do want to tell you, bringing up Kat, she got to preach for the first time today, and she just like
What?
nailed it. Like, I know I'm biased and stuff, but like she nailed it, and not just from me. Like, numerous people said this, and it's cool because Catholic and also come from the background. Like, there's certain regulations, but then being a part of our church, they allowed it, so she got to get up and speak. And she talked about Luke 15 and the prodigal son, and kind of the same theme, really, of like how we need to listen to people, give them the benefit of the doubt, like connect to God to try to understand them rather than basing it on our own personal information. And it was so fantastic. And I was just like, man, we get to do conservatism on tap and talk about how we work with people. And she's talking about it, from the church and all this stuff. And, connecting to, I think she said it, putting God's story above your own story is how she said it. And how important is that, And you look at all these examples in history of people doing that, and you see that it's still alive. So in addition to all the localism that we're talking about and everything else, kind of connecting to this deeper narrative as well, like it was fun, man. It was fun.
So, yeah, a couple things about that I was just thinking about. First off was that I recall like our parents like talking before, and they're like, how do you feel about John? How do you feel about a woman preaching? And I was like, let me think about it this way. Like, if God can raise someone from the dead, I'm pretty sure the rest is just rock and roll, right? I mean, no big deal. I mean, I'm pretty sure we can just do.
I've never heard that before.
So
it's just rock and roll. There's your quote from tonight. Like,
it is. What I really got to give the Kat is that, like, first off, it takes a whole lot of guts to get up there and preach and to do a sermon, because if I feel like all I could do in preaching would be like, I would read the Bible and pretty much be like, so there you go. Am I right? Huh? Right?
Well,
There's some
scriptures.
I wouldn't know what to say.
Yeah, I know. I want to ask about this because, going back to that question, and feel free to be honest, like, I've got plenty of beer, so I'm not going to be offended. But I'm curious to get your take on it, because I think my impression of Burke would be he had this empirical side to him, right? He had this empiricism, which a lot of people struggle with because he still had it grounded in a sense of natural law and morality. But Burke, to me, was this guy of like, before we rush to judgment on someone, let's find out. Before we think that someone is going to be amazing, let's give it time and investigate, right? He had this interesting investigative nature to him. And honestly, Josh, like that's what I tell my wife. Like, that's what I apply when she started, exploring this and the potential to speak and all that. And I'll tell you the reason that she spoke was because the main pastor in the church had COVID. And so he was down and his family was down and all that kind of stuff. So they needed someone. And she was like, okay, I'm willing to step in. And she had never done it before, even though she worked there. So it's not like she's the main pastor or anything like that, like taking over or anything. But she had this opportunity. But going back to like morality in a sense of, is this okay or not? Because there's parts of the Bible that someone could say, oh, Paul said this or whatever. My impression of Burke is he'd be like, I don't know, let's try it. Like, he would be this, empirical type of guy who says, yep, I understand the natural law of this. I understand that like there's differences between men and women. I understand that you guys debate over this specific issue, but let's give it a try and see how it works. Oh, like, turns out they can speak. Wow, they can actually speak pretty well. And to John's point, like, maybe at times better than us. Like, maybe we should listen to them, So I don't know. How do you feel about that, Josh?
How do I feel about women preachers?
Yeah, for that. And then just the empirical nature of exploring like religion, how it applies, or do you feel like it's kind of set in stone?
Well, those are interesting but divergent questions. So maybe I'll try to pick them apart.
Yeah.
The women preachers is obviously an interesting issue because there are scriptures that could support the notion that women ought not to preach in church. Yeah. I was raised in a really conservative religious background, not necessarily in a political sense, but a old Free Holiness church. The women wore dresses; they didn't wear makeup. The guys wore long sleeve shirts, and we didn't even wear neckties because that would make us look like Pentecostal holiness, and they were just way too radical for us.
Well, they're pretty radical for anyway. I mean,
yes, but in spite of that sort of ultra conservative, very sharp distinction between the sexes, interestingly enough, the church tradition I grew up in never had an issue with female pastors.
Huh.
And they weren't the predominant, there are definitely more male pastors than female. But I don't ever remember, even in that ultra conservative environment, it ever being frowned upon or even questioned. And I say that up front because I think we all kind of enter into this with especially if we are Christian and we're raised in a church in a sense. I think we enter into this some sort of a bias that we grew up with.
Yeah.
Certainly our culture today, it's very dangerous in most circles to suggest that a female cannot preach, even if someone's trying to make a scriptural reference, because it just seems so countercultural, so politically incorrect, very dangerous to say. But I think it's a complicated issue. What exactly is Paul getting at? But to be honest with you, I don't think the Apostle Paul had in mind the actual church structure as we recognize it here in America today. It would probably look extremely foreign to the Apostle Paul.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And how that would meld with his particular message, which I think, in my mind, has far more to do with the distinctions between the sexes and the roles and the strengths that we have, and less to do with a prohibition against women involvement in church.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's a good point. Like,
I think
one of the things that Kat taught me was, that sure, there's the scriptures and like elevated by God, inspired and all this stuff, but then there's all this other literature as well, including like other accounts that show Paul having a disciple himself who was female, who spoke, Thecla, and she did all these amazing things, and it's recorded. And most of the church fathers agree that was very credible, but it's not something that they elevated to the point of divine scripture. They just said, hey, this is great history and like interesting stuff. It's credible, but we're not going to put it into the actual Bible because we have to cut it off somewhere, and we've prayed and we believe this is it. But it's still an account, that like all of them go to, and it speaks to Paul kind of saying, hey, like, this is a great thing because he discipled her. So that's kind of part of the things that she showed me, which is fascinating. But no, it's cool, man. It's very cool perspective.
It is interesting you saying that. It makes me think, all three of us, it sounds like, are Protestant, grew up in a Protestant background, most comfortable with Protestantism. Catholicism, and I definitely have my criticisms, say, of Catholicism or Greek Orthodox or the more highbrow churches. But I also believe that God the Father, or God, communicates to his people in three primary ways. One is the Holy Scripture, one is the Holy Spirit, and then one is the tradition of the church. And the Catholics and Greek Orthodox obviously have a greater handle on the tradition of the church. Now, speaking as a Protestant, that can go wrong, but I don't think you have to tax your imagination too much to notice that, turns out me reading the Bible and listening to the Holy Spirit can also go really wrong too.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that these three different modes, say, of understanding what God is speaking into our lives are all valuable, but susceptible to human corruption. And I'm a Protestant. I defend that, but I also recognize that there is sort of a disadvantage in trying to throw off all that was wrong with the old church.
Oh, dude, that's fascinating. It's very well said. Very well.
I think
John,
I have a story just to kind of, I think, embody what Josh is talking about, which is, going back to when we were talking about Catholicism, and, I didn't really get introduced very much to any sort of cathedral or the traditions of the Catholic Church until we had met Kat. But, you say what you want about the Eucharist, and, does it actually become the body of Christ? Does it actually become the blood of Christ? That seems a little bit strange to me and a little bit weird. And you have it every time that you're there. It's practically lost its significance, hasn't it, by that point? And then, I go to my church right when I'm thinking these thoughts. And we were out there in the middle of like July. It was hot. We were having some type of tailgate party, but they wanted to have like the Lord's Supper. And I think they wanted to do it kind of like conveniently. And so they passed out like these little plastic cups of juice that had like a pre-wrapped like communion wafer on top, that like, it's almost like a communion in a package, just like that, and like they just kind of like
dip it in your mango salsa. Like, it's great.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you're just looking for like, where's the olive oil? Where's the dipping sauce? Like they're just like passing out, communion, like you're at a tailgate party. And there was just something so deeply wrong about that in my spirit. And I started looking back on, the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart and saying like, okay, maybe I'm not convinced that this has actually become the body of Christ, like literally in my body. But I can see why I want to believe that, because if that was true, there is absolutely no way that I'd be having communion like this. Like, it needs to be wrapped in prayer, not
Yeah,
in
no,
some like piece of plastic. It needs to be a holy moment and not just something that you're doing on a whim. And then, if it's like going to bring us together, why aren't we doing this more often? Why am I doing this like only once every 5 to 6 weeks whenever we can, swing it? So like, it was those kind of things that I felt like the tradition does help preserve the sense of sanctity and the honor and the holiness and the gravity of like what is actually occurring in your spirit. Because if we just run with it without that kind of tradition, then all of a sudden it leads into some type of like Happy Meal package that isn't going to go anywhere for you.
That's dude. That's fascinating. Like both of you guys, like I think it's amazing what you just said, and it's so needed. Like again, this discussion is so needed. I always bring it back to Burke because he's that person who kind of lives in the nuance and he lives in the whole like, hey, we've got to investigate and we've got to find out. And I also think that when you look at churches, like bringing in a little bit of Plato here, it's much like looking at governments. There is no such thing as perfection, in this life, short of Jesus himself, right? Like, who is not only of this earth, but also of God. And because there's no such thing as perfection, these, constructs that we build or the churches that we build, the governments that we build, there's always going to be some level of imperfection in them, right? They're going to reflect the people who, put it together, who try to worship the best that they can, and therefore there's going to be goodness in it, but there's also going to be imperfection, just like there's goodness and imperfection in me, right? Like, and unless like there isn't in you, Josh, like I'm sure we're in the same spot, right? And the same thing for John, and because of that, that's why the discussion happens, right? That's why prayer happens. That's why we need God. All of these things, and so when you start to realize like I'm doing the best that I can, and I'm going to try. I'm never going to be perfect. And that's what I told Kat, by the way, when you preach, I was like, you're going to do great. You're going to nail it. It's going to be awesome. It's not going to be perfect, and that's okay because you're not perfect and I'm not. None of us are, and that's kind of the point, right? Like, of the prodigal son in particular, as well as his brother. And because we're not perfect, we're in this mode of constantly exploring and learning and growing, and that really is humanity. That is humanity. That's what you find in the Bible, is that like we're transient, we're learning, we're imperfect, and we're trying. You go back to like David and his heart for God of making mistakes, but then coming clean. And the same spirit applies to us all the time, whether it's politics and talking to liberals and moderates and everyone from libertarians to communists, whether it's religion, talking to other denominations and all that, even other religions and trying to understand where you're coming from. Why does this appeal to you? That type of thing. Down to culture and back to like Kiwi, like, okay, let's try it. Like, let's see what happens, no safety regulations, but like, maybe it'll be worth it, like it's this, it's a life built on exploration and fun and experience and mystery, as opposed to a life built on judgment and hate and stereotypes and misconceptions. So I saw my wife, doing that. I appreciate you guys like that way, like you clearly are those type of folks. You don't rush to judgment. You want to talk about it, and that's what we got to do on this show.
Yeah.
So,
And Josh, I want to appreciate you, by the way, for interviewing Wes on the podcast a few days ago. I was listening to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, glad to do it. We had a great discussion.
Yeah, it was one of the things that stood out to me in the discussion that relates, I promise, to what we're talking about, is when y'all were examining Burke, which I thought was great. We haven't talked about, the principles of Burke on Conservatism on Tap in a bit, just due to the election coverage. Yeah. But I'm glad that you were able to give that coverage, because one of the things y'all talked about was about how Burke puts a lot of trust in mankind as a whole throughout time, and saying that as a whole, mankind can be wise. But in that one moment, if you're just isolated from from anyone else, like, you are going to make rash decisions. You probably can't trust yourself. Like, you have no basis of where you're making decisions except your own conscience. And that's not enough. You need everyone together. And it was making me think about the structure of the church and what's more needed and what's recommended, I think. And there's a book called Why People Leave the Church. It's by David Kinnigan.
Oh, yeah.
It's, Yeah, it's written a few years ago, I think 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
But one of the things he really advocated for was a sense of mentorship, because especially in the Protestant church, there is this sense of isolating people by their age groups almost all throughout their life. So this is the place for the singles. This is the place for the young married couples. This is the place for the college students. This is the place for the senior citizens. This is the place for the widowers, like all that. And, there's not this, the communal sense comes, I guess, in the worship service, but he had found out that in many churches, you don't have a clear idea of mentorship happening across these age groups and across these demographics. And if, one of the stories he had was of this, older person basically saying like, kids nowadays, they don't respect you. They don't say anything to you. They don't even know my name. And like the one question that David asked her was, okay, well, do you know any of their names? She's like, no, why would I? He's like, so you haven't even tried to reach out to mentor any of these people? She's like, no, they need it. Basically, she kind of felt this sense that they need to reach out to me. And I kind of am wondering, Wes, our dad is so good about mentoring youth. Like he was a youth minister, but like he gets so vibrant when someone that is seeking his advice, and he can take them along to like Thanksgiving or bring them over for like a holiday, and he can like imbue some wisdom into their life. And I just feel like that's what we need throughout all of our life, is someone to mentor, someone to be mentored to help bridge that age gap, because that's a lot of reasons why people leave the church. They feel so disconnected, even though they might have been connected in a small group that was their age bracket.
So, it's just, I gotta tell you this. So in the service, like that Catherine did, she gets up after the music and everything else. She preaches the sermon, and then she closes. She like brings it home. They have a prayer. They have another song, and then they have this gentleman named Jim who comes up, and Jim is like one of the I don't know if I can say this, one of the older guys in the church, right? Like. But everybody loves him. Everybody, because he's just such a kind and like well-read, well-respected guy. I always like give him crap for whatever. So I'm like, he doesn't even know like that I would say this, but everybody respects Jim because he's just like this senior, like elder of the church, right? And he comes up and he gives like a couple sentence closure, and it's all. I love when they do that. It's like they'll have the main pastor give a sermon, they'll have a guest give the sermon. And then at the end of it, Jim comes up and he always kind of seals it. And he always brings in some like huge, like theological point that's like almost equivalent to the sermon himself, being like, this was good and I'll tell you why. And then he like tells a joke, right? Like after his theological, like, signing off on it. It's just really cool. Like it's the mixture of tradition speaking there. Like there's wisdom and experience, someone who's twice the age of like my wife getting up there to be like, good sermon, and it's this intersection of like youth and inexperience and ambition and passion with like, experience and wisdom and tradition and all the things that we've talked about. And again, that goes back to society. I mean, when we talk about why is the Constitution a good thing? Why is reading Burke as opposed to purely listening to Donald Trump a good thing? It goes back to this canon of thought that Josh talked about and what we can gain from it. So, man, I appreciate you guys being on the show. This was a lot of fun. Josh, one more time, tell it, because we've got some people watching live. Tell us one more time about the effort that you're doing and how people can take a look at it, what you got coming up next, all that stuff.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if I've mentioned this to you or not, Wes, but just a day or two ago, I got Yuval Levin to say he'd come on the show. Assuming we can work out the scheduling, but
good for you.
I know he's kind of a mutual intellectual giant of ours, and I just love his book, The Great Debate. So, but yes, great.
I have it right here.
You have it right handy.
You're going to say that, but here it is right here.
That's awesome.
Yuval Levin is a huge Burke scholar, brilliant guy, sweet dude, and just super smart. So, I got a chance. It's one of the first interviews that I did with the Burke and Conservative. So I had no idea, but that is like kudos to you, bro. Like that is amazing.
He was, and that was a great interview. He is among being all of those things you just mentioned. I think one of the things I would say of Yuval Levin is he also has what I would consider to be a lot of respect and insight even into the left, and can speak authoritatively about the left and the right, which is just amazing. But yes, great people like Yuval and say again.
Where can we see that? So when are you going to release
Yeah,
it, and how do
is there a
people?
date?
Hasn't been recorded yet, so I don't know
Okay.
just yet. We're still working out the scheduling,
Got
but
it. Got
Saving Elephants blog at .com is
Okay.
how you'd find the website. If you go to savingelephants.com, you'll find people trying to save actual elephants. So
Mm. Also
savingelephants.blog.com.
good. We support
You
it.
should partner with them.
Yes.
SavingElephantsBlog.com. We got it. Cool. Well, thank you, man. No, thank you for being on the show. Loved having you here. Like, what a blessing. And like I said, what an honor to have you on here. And I love your perspective and everything that you brought. And then, of course, John, thank you so much. Any last words for you, John? I appreciate you being here too.
No, just Josh. I really appreciate you being here. Hope we can have you on again. I would love to hear a little bit more about when you first encountered Burke. And I'd love for us to talk a little bit more about your own personal journey through reading Burke and what that was like for you, and whether or not you latched onto him pretty quickly or slowly. But if we can have you on again, that would be what I would love to talk
We'd
about
love
with you.
anytime.
Definitely love to do it.
All right. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, John.
Cool.
And for everybody else, we will see you next week, same time, 9 o'clock Central for the Breaking Conservative. We're out here.